The next object that we're going to look at is one that is probably very familiar to you, and that is newspapers. Newspapers, of course, are the most popular medium for conveying knowledge, at least until the age of the internet, where now the paper version, of course, has migrated online to a large extent. Nevertheless, the characteristics of the newspaper remain, and it's interesting to sort of think about the newspaper as an object of knowledge and how that's composed. And what we have here are, we're going to look at a couple of examples, examples that are addressing the same topic, which is Britain's vote to leave the European Union, which took place in June 2016. And this generated an enormous amount of journalistic coverage at the time, and in fact, newspapers were divided as to what they thought about the topic of Brexit and whether Britain should leave the European Union or not. And so we have here a very striking contrast in this case, and between the Guardian, which is a left-leaning newspaper, which is for Britain remaining in the European Union, and the Daily Mail, which is the largest circulation tabloid right-wing newspaper in the United Kingdom, which was very much about supporting the idea of Britain leaving the European Union. Now, the interesting thing, and this has been true throughout the history of newspapers, is that there's a sense in which newspapers can generally agree, though perhaps not always, but generally speaking, they can agree on what the basic facts of the situation are. So in the case of Brexit, we're talking about a vote that all citizens of the UK were eligible to participate in. It occurred on a certain day in June, and the consequences of the decision, at least the immediate advertised consequences in terms of Britain leaving the European Union, which is what officially the vote was about, everybody could agree on that, right? But then where the disagreements start to emerge is how to interpret this situation, and especially how to interpret the outcome of the situation. And as it turns out, Brexit won. Britain left the European Union. The vote was quite a narrow one, 52% to 48%. There was very high voter turnout. And so it was, when you were given that kind of information, then you can imagine a great deal of polarization over how it's interpreted, depending on whether you believe it's a good idea for Britain to leave the European Union. And so we see here with the Guardian and the Daily Mail very contrasting visions of all this. One of the things that is very interesting, if we look at the Guardian, for example, is that the Guardian, which supports Britain remaining in the European Union, takes a very sort of chastened view of the situation, namely that so it's not denying the vote, it's not saying the vote was unfair in any kind of way, but it basically kind of admits that the argument wasn't made properly, and indeed part of what people were responding to was in fact what they have felt, at least according to the Guardian, as years of neglect, especially people who do not live in the more metropolitan areas of the UK, such as London. And so the Guardian interprets this as kind of a lesson for politicians to learn in terms of trying to redress the balance so that such a large percentage of the population does not feel alienated from the political system. And so in this regard, the attack on Brussels that took place by leaving the European Union is really an attack on Westminster. And so the Guardian is trying to derive some lessons and so forth that people can learn from. But make no mistake, the Guardian's whole tone in the matter is rather downcast and pessimistic, actually, in terms of where does this leave Britain standing in the world, okay? And by the way, some of this gloom actually carried on for the next few years, especially once Donald Trump got elected president, which happened at the end of 2016, right? So a few months after the Brexit vote, Trump got elected to his first term of office. And then the issue was going to be how Britain deals with that, because Trump and Britain are not necessarily natural allies. And so this idea of Britain being isolated and have to redefine itself is very much on the forefront of the Guardian's mind. Now, in contrast, the Daily Mail takes a much more upbeat view of the situation. And it's interesting how it goes about the argument, because basically it attacks Brussels for being corrupt, right? That the European Union, in a sense, has extracted, so many billions of pounds from the UK as well as from the other member states for many years. And there's a question of what has it got in return, and if anything, it has made kind of the social problems in the UK exacerbated. And in particular, they draw attention to the immigration issue, because part of being a member of the European Union is that you have to have open borders with regard to people coming from other member states in the European Union. And so that's one thing that the Daily Mail flags, that now could be sort of shut down, so they thought, right, that immigration could be controlled as a result of Britain leaving the European Union. So there is this kind of marvelous future on the horizon. Also, I would say a very interesting feature about the Daily Mail coverage of it, which in a way draws attention to what journalism can do with regard to facts, is the sort of statistics that the Daily Mail mobilizes in support of Brexit. Now, it turns out, and I think again, nobody, whether you're on the left wing or the right wing, would disagree with this, is that at least until the time Britain left the European Union, about 45% of British trade was with the European Union. 45%, that's quite a lot. Places like America and so forth, with which Britain has strong trade relations, we're talking about in the teens of percentages or even lower, right? So 45% with the European Union. Now, that's not how the Daily Mail represents this fact. In fact, it doesn't really mention it at all. Instead, what it does is it folds in the issue of trade into the larger issue of the British economy. Right? And so one of the things that you'll notice in this particular article is that that the British economy, 80% of all the transactions that take place in the British economy take place within the United Kingdom. Now, that's probably not surprising, right? That 80% of the transactions are economic transactions, which means that from that standpoint, looking at larger economic figure, the percentage that actually is due to trade with the European Union is only 10%. Okay? But that's because you're folding in trade into this larger understanding of economic transactions. The point that the Daily Mail is trying to make with this is a point about saying it doesn't matter so much. That there's a sense in which the contributions that the European Union had been making to the British economy are relatively marginal. Now, you can deal with this kind of interpretation as you will, but I think one of the things that's quite interesting is, of course, in journalism, there is a sense, and this is true even in academic writing, to be perfectly honest, that there is a kind of cherry picking, right? That there is a sense in which you can select your facts, and the facts that you select do not need to be wrong. They're not necessarily wrong. It's just whether that's the relevant fact that you want to focus on with regard to making the argument, right? And so here, the Daily Mail and the Guardian and other newspapers would have serious disagreements. But this is basically kind of what journalism provides for us, and we have to be critical readers. And the reason why we have got these two different ideologically different newspapers looking at the topic of Brexit is because this is generally the way you should be looking at the news. In other words, you should not be just looking at one news source, because it's true that most of the news sources that are available will be able to give you the basic facts of a situation. But what you will get based on the ideological formation of the newspaper is different ways of framing these facts and different ways of saying which facts are important as opposed to which other facts. And these are things where there can be serious disagreement. And you need to, as it were, see examples of these different framings and these different interpretation of the facts in order to make a sound critical judgment that can then inform whatever votes you're taking, whatever policies you're making. And so, for this reason, given that we live in an online world where more than ever the differences of opinion are accessible, right? So you can go to the Daily Mail website, you can go to the Guardian's website for free. You don't have to pay for a paper newspaper anymore. That you should take advantage of that and then do your own comparison of what these ideologically different papers say about some common topic of interest to you.